There you go, you've got a load of Irish Marines. Very impressive. So this is a nice weather for you.
Yeah, no, I left.
You were there in the height of
Just before you know, was so intense.
Yeah. I mean, it was just all of these fraud, sort of.
That means
Yeah.
So this is like
we're different. This is why we our top six so
Oh, you didn't. I was feeling too. You see who's on there? I was feeling too.
At the end of it, like the biggest producer.
Just because I joined the session, yeah.
We're building houses for other people from Michigan. That was the last of the madness.
Yeah, no, I agree. But I mean,
No, I know I haven't seen it, but still it feels very familiar. I don't know, maybe the thought like someone is
Brendan will.
I don't know.
We're so looking for physical None of them went into recession during the economic. We're all very populous Asian countries and we're still doing well. Right, I think we'll get this on the road.
We sit down.
Okay, we've got 6 friends on Zoom.
we have.
Okay, folks, I'll just do a little introduction there. I'm not even sure I'm qualified to do this, but even though. So thanks again to Josh for organizing this seminar series. One of the cool things about the expansion of our discipline to be management and international relations is we end up getting seminars or whatever this is being called, a conversation like this, right? I used to love working in universities where you go to some seminar for some mad discipline you never really sort of comprehended or fully understood. And that was really a great part of working in universities. When I saw the abstract that Sara sent out today, I thought this is a really good example of sort of a way to have a little bit of a intellectual expansion, if you like, because the discipline of management, you could imagine, is very businessy focused. We have a few employment relations scholars who do stuff that wouldn't be necessarily considered business. And then we now have international relations scholars who are obviously from a political background. So a really cool sort of opportunity for us in management discipline to think a little bit differently, look at the world a bit differently. We always obviously acknowledge country. So the place we're meeting now is for the Pambalon Planet, the Awabakal Nation, a land that was never ceded, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging leaders. And again, we acknowledge custodianship, not ownership, because we are now us custodians of this land as well, and we should take that responsibility seriously. So I just found out that Bryan, like myself, was educated in Ireland, so we're two Irish people here, and Sara. But I'm going to let Sara introduce Bryan because she knows obviously your intellectual background, and introduce yourself because some people may not know you. So you're the host from us.
Am I?
So I'm going to hand over to you, and thank you very much for coming up the road, Bryan, all the way from Galway. Sara, over to you. You can introduce each other if you like.
Yeah. We had a conversation about what we're going to do. All right. Yeah. Okay, I know. So we're going to do something a little bit unusual, right? Instead of introducing each other, we're mainly going to introduce ourselves mostly, but I thought I'd start by talking about the first time I ever met Sara. Many years ago. I think it was around 2015-ish. I was a PhD student in the philosophy department at the University of Queensland, and a mutual friend organized a South-South Dialogue conference, and it was a student-led conference. Didn't have any kind of funding or support, and we were trying to get a keynote with no money. And if you've ever tried to organize a big thing, fancy important people tend not to respond to emails to or come to events that students are running. But lo and behold, Sarah actually agreed to come along. We're all very, very, very excited. And she gave a spectacular keynote. She was just like a really big presence at that event. And I remember, you know, I turned that presentation into a journal article, but it changed quite a bit because of the provocation. And just the impact that kind of Sarah's contribution had made. And that was my very first encounter with her. And I've kind of followed her work. And again, liminal subjects, her book is another, you know, it's proven to be like another really impactful and helpful kind of like work and series of provocations for my own thinking. And so, yeah. That was my first encounter with Sarah. I was doing a PhD in philosophy at the time. I since finished, and before that, I had kind of like I have a medical background. I grew up in Zimbabwe. I worked as a doctor for a little bit. I moved to Ireland, studied philosophy, and here we are. I would say.
This isn't the me situating, or is this the situating bit? Or more situating?
Talk about your more situation.
We will do more.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, yeah, I'm honouring and acknowledging where we're meeting this waterway point of fresh and salt water of the Awabakal and Worimi, and I'm paying my respects to elders past, present, and emergent, and other Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, Indigenous peoples present today. Hello. It's so nice to see you faces. I love this. This is so nice. I'm also calling to presence my own ancestral lineages of the Chibcha Muisca of the Eastern Cordillera of the Andes, of the Eastern European Jewish and of the Celtic, and also the ways that I've been held by Worimi clan here, Dates clan here, and kind of accepted as a sister auntie. And quiero convocar las energías de las abuelas que nos ayuden a tejer hoy día con escucha profunda y con ternura, pero ternura no como ausencia. And I re-encounter, so I remember this kind of my memory, not just I think because I'm menopausal, but also because of the fragments of the way that trauma crisscrosses my being means that my memory comes and goes, and it's very much about presence. So when somebody is present for me, then I'm like, oh, these pieces and fragments come back to my mind. Anyway, so me and someone else called Bina Fernandez in Melbourne are organising a workshop, a kind of post-colonial, anti-colonial, anti-racism workshop in November. And so we were thinking of the kinds of people that we wanted to invite. And we were very much thinking about what might it mean to speak together in our own terms across the exteriority of precarities and of racialization on the colonial frontier, right? And so it was like, we actually want, you know, First Nations from these lands, Southern scholars and people of colour, right? And people who are doing that work to try and piece together liberations in a plural sense, which are not about reproducing or reinforcing the settler colony, but about reimagining well-being and life worlds otherwise, yeah? So it connects into business in the sense it's multiple economies and multiple forms of governance and multiple forms of being, right, beyond possessive subjectivity. So, and then that encounter came on the email, and from the email then came these threads of remembering, but also the possibility of why it matters to take our time to encounter with depth, right? And to create the spaces where we can gradually start to translate across our singularities and our experiences and our knowledges, and how sharing in the lands that hold us is also an important part of that. And so then it was like, well, we should come here because we have this discipline. And that even though it's management and IR, and in some ways there's a kind of unbelonging, even though there's a belonging, right? It's like Josh has got these connections with the way in which he has this labourist tradition and this. So there's these critical, unlikely subjects that exist in spaces. Sometimes we don't know. And so there's an openness, right, to that, to be disrupted, to be unsettled, and to hold the space for otherness, for the others, right, that are often maybe a little bit illegible and devalued. So this is how this has come about. And it's saying, okay, so we are now on the 8th floor and we're sitting here in a space that in many ways can feel quite displacing and disconnected, but with a community, a diverse community who have relationalities, or have relationalities with most of the people here, right, and online as well. And that feels really special because there's kind of a bit of there's a welcoming, but also an honouring, and that's, and we're at the top. I usually sit at the bottom, either for rooting it or up here for division. So I kind of think it's quite nice we're up here and that you can see the complexities of this landscape. So that's kind of how we're here. And we've had a previous little walk and talk with a couple of people yesterday to drop into some of the ways that we might relate. And then afterwards, we're also this evening going to go out and have some supper about 5:30 to continue, right? Because there's certain things we can say or feel comfortable saying and being and doing in a space like this, and some things we don't, right? So yeah, that's the way we come to encounter, or for me, I'm coming into encounter with you.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. Okay. So I mean, one of the points of intersection was like this work, right? Liminal subjects. And, I think that I found that really strikes me about it is it seems like there are these three threads that you weave together. There's the theoretical, the aesthetic, and work with and in community, right? So there's a community piece, the kind of theoretical piece, and there's the aesthetic piece. And each of them by themselves, like just this huge body and area of work that's incredibly laborious, and it just takes a lot to delve into and sink your teeth into any one of them, right? To be a good practitioner, either in theory or in the aesthetic or in work that's related to the community, is just incredibly laborious. And I'm really curious about the work of doing all three and bringing all three together, especially when you're located in a discipline like politics and political theory, where people tend to pick one and run with just the one. And when you're writing and you're in conversation, you tend to be in conversation with people who are attuned to just the one of them, right? And so, I'm interested in who you're speaking to, in having multiple conversations at the same time, and the challenge of being legible or being recognized when you're when you're engaged in a kind of discourse that most people can are only familiar maybe with one thread or two threads, and a lot of it, there's a danger that it goes unread or can't be read.
Okay, so we're walking now in
Yeah.
the institution, then you're going to walk
Yeah.
in the institution too. Okay, so there was something yesterday, I'll ask him back as well. So there was something yesterday we were talking about, and Annette was talking about life and this dedication to life and creating our capacity to breathe in institutions and in modes of kind of anti-life, which often constrict our capacity to breathe and our capacity for well-being. And And I know there's going to be stuff that's indecipherable here, right, in the different places that we're in, but I don't think that matters. Like, I think sometimes we have to be comfortable with not understanding and not knowing. And I think we also sometimes can drop into understanding and knowing. We can drop into understanding and knowing with our heart and our flesh, right? And not just with the cognitive. So there was something that I wanted to, and it came up with the first year's last week actually, about ghosts and about ancestors, and just about the importance of remembering like why we do the work that we do. And so my work has always been related to my communities, of which I have multiple, like you do. Some are in the institutions and some are outside the institutions, and they're across different lands. So it's kind of the navigation of the plural has been something that has been an experience of mine since I was born, really. Navigation of different cultures and classes and languages and territorios, right, and lands, and different worlds, actually, like formal worlds, and then the worlds that kind of rendered abject or rendered absent or rendered deviant. So that plurality has been something that has been my being in the world, and then became a politicized being in the world as a mestizaje, right? Kind of decolonial abolitionist feminism, which moves with that complexity as something that is generative. And so this is work that is dedicated to life and well-being, and it's dedicated to ancestors and ghosts as present with us now, right? And for future generations. So I did want to read, because Liminal Subjects was written a while ago, and, you know, she is meant to be something that's useful. And it's actually really nice that Bryan brings her here and brings her back, because I can forget. We can forget. We can forget our ancestors. We can forget our ghosts, right? And I think we lose something when we do that. So this was actually in memory of someone called Karen, whose birthday was actually a few days ago, and who basically, you know, was murdered by the intersecting violences of the state and how they crisscross our communities. And it's called A Life Half Lived. And it was written for her and for many subjects like her, with the hope that this could be useful in helping us to live as we live lives well and together, right? And in dignity and in cultivating our own healing as not an individualistic therapeutic healing, but as a political form of commoning, right? And a political form of creating our societies otherwise. So I actually want to invoke Karen today. So I thought I'd read this poem, if that's okay, yeah? So it's called A Life Half Lived. I close my eyes, see your face, Egyptian eyes, aquiline-shaped dolphin lips that gently kissed his newly birthed head, a gaze of tenderness, blue flowers in your hair. I fumble with the telephone keys to longingly stare at the last photo, sweet humility of your caress, hiding the devastation and distress of a life half lived, in generosity met with violence, derision, and neglect. I turn on the CD player, an unknown song in French, hear your voice of many tongues translating between peoples, nurturing justice, dignity, and respect. Singing songs in Finsbury Park to make money to buy French bread and hummus, break bread together in harmony, desires met. I watch my baby sleeping, flickering image cross my mind of sharing a bed, morning games of giggles and plans and dreams, no regrets. I look up from my coffee to the faces of the women of Ramallah, the women you suffered with, the women you fought with, like a lioness with graceful courage, standing tall in the face of their tanks and the bullets that took the children away. There is a thread, red and gold, an old-looking thread that's been through the wars, been washed away by storms, repeatedly torn, a thread that connects us through space and time to tie our hearts and hands to keep the flame alive. My eyes close again. This time sleep covers over me like a wave of memories, too much to remember, too precious to forget, too measurable to confine in a measure of time. Today is the day I open my eyes, feel your brokenness, and realize you weren't meant to die. So I think, and it reminded me too, like we can be rememberings for each other, right? We can create sanctuary and shelter for each other with the offerings that we drop in. And I think that Annette reminded me that plurality actually is my fluency. It's not something that is external and I have to try to do. I can't but be like that. And that it's about dedication to our lives, and that the modes of codification and the modes of rendering accountable into institutionality, which require us to slice up into parts that are quantifiable, that are codifiable, that are boxifiable, and that are, what's the word we talked about this morning? Standardizable, right, is actually something that is anti the life of a plural commoning subject that is actually dedicated to building other worlds, right? And that is a tension point too, because it does mean that there is illegibility and there is something of that complexity that always is rendered abject or outside or lacking of value or problematic or deviant or to be, I don't know, brought into line. And that can then result in particular violations, right? And particular erasures, which are part of the settler logic of things, yeah? But at the same time, there is a joy and a beauty in that. Like Karen wasn't abject, right? She spoke multiple tongues. She was actually in Palestine, which is actually interesting. She was in Palestine for a long time, standing on the front lines, right? And her life was complex, even if cut short too soon. And our lives are complex, but there is also a joy in that because there's things that escape and things that we can do in the midst of spaces which have those logics of codifying and slicing up and removing the possibility of those complex plural lives that we can inhabit in other ways. So like we're inhabiting, right, in other ways right now. And that indecipherability can also be read, as Glisson talks about, as a right to opacity. So our right to be seen on our own terms, in our own ways, in the different spaces that we might find ourselves in. So I think there's
it's really interesting. This semester I teach a class in the philosophy of race and gender. And the second piece that I get us to the class to read is an article by Mariana Ortega titled "Bodies of Color, Bodies of Sorrow." And she has this line in it where she's like, we have to carry our dead, we have to carry our dead with us. And it's funny, there's this really, really interesting tension because on the one hand, she's like, there's a kind of sorrow that people belonging to marginalized communities, like necessarily kind of by virtue of that marginalization carry, right? And this injunction to carry the dead, to remember, is in some ways a call to not evade, to not run away from that sorrow and to sit in it, which I find really hard because for me, like one of the joys of theory is an ability to run away from, to evade actually feeling the things and to be able to abstract and theorize them, right? To be able to take kind of sorrow, hold it at a distance, kind of perform conceptual surgery on it in a way that gives you a kind of power over it. The work of actually sitting with that sorrow, working through it, figuring out how to do intellectual work in and around it in ways that aren't exploitative, that aren't extractive, and also like collaboratively in ways that allow for a kind of a cultivation of a joyous community. That's incredibly, incredibly difficult, I find anyway.
What does it give you to dissect sorrow conceptually, or what does it not allow you? How does it allow you to navigate the halls of the institution in particular ways, and how does it disallow you to inhabit yourself in
Yeah.
plural ways?
Oh, that's a lovely question. Yeah, like when we were speaking earlier, you're like, how do you kind of like walk all of this stuff? My first thought was like, I think I'm a bit two-faced with it, in the sense that like, on the one hand, there's this kind of an intellectual mastery, right? Or the attempts towards an intellectual mastery and to intellectualize things means that I can attend to the things that are really important to me and that are really important to communities to which I belong, but without being subject to the weight of it in a way. It's like once upon a time I worked as a hospital-based doctor in context of the AIDS pandemic. So lots of kind of distress, pain, suffering. And in order to kind of be in those wards on a daily basis, there's a kind of callousness that you need to cultivate. There's an ability to kind of look and to understand, but not feel all of the things and not feel too deeply and to kind of dissociate yourself in some ways, because you have to do it the next day and the next day and the next day and the next day, right? Mm. And there's, there's a kind of arrogance, I think, when at the beginning of my academic career, I was susceptible to. I kind of looked around. I was like, there aren't very many people like me in these philosophy spaces. That's okay. Like, low key, I guess I'm just a little bit brilliant, so I'll be fine, right? Like the same processes that meant that others who might be like me have been filtered away. It's all right. I'll just kind of like, Fanon has this line about Kierkegaard singing and dancing on the tightrope of existence. I'm like, I'll just sing and dance on this kind of tightrope and I'll be fine. And then you're like, after a while, it's like, no, the processes that mean that I looked around and I didn't see very many other people like me, that they're at play and they're going to affect me as well, right? And I think one way writing about that, thinking about that, abstracting, trying to create some distance from what I feel of the experience and to create that distance by intellectualizing it is a way of carrying on. But that can only go so far. I guess the other side of it is finding and creating kind of communities of care, like making common cause with others, gathering with others who are also pushing back against that current. Yeah.
There was a mayora when I was in Colombia for sabbatical. So I eventually got sabbatical. It was quite a battle to get it, but eventually got that one. There was a mayora in Colombia, an Afro-Colombian mayora when I was in Cali last year. And I was doing some interviews for this documentary that we haven't got money to edit it, but it will eventually happen. And it's all mother-wise, and it's the role of like mothers in a very broad sense in inhabiting the city otherwise during this uprising and like creating all these communities of care and other economies and other kind of food distribution and other forms of space to actually allow the grief. And they have a political school for the youth. And one of the things, a big strand of this political school is like leyendo territorio, like teaching through critical pedagogies, right, of story and remembering and so on, different knowledges, how to read the territory. So how to collectively learn to read the way that institutions of, I don't really call it settler colony there, it's more like coloniality, right? Or the urban reproduces objection and the making abject and forms of dispossession against the racialized body, right? Or the racialized flesh is not really even seen as a subject. And so, supporting in the reading of when in a space of political encounter, whether that's you're taking over a road or whether it's you're occupying a space or whether you're, setting up a political school, that you learn to read together the coordinates of how power is working and whether it is time to retreat, whether it's time to stay and dwell, and whether it is time to bridge, right? And that is an exceedingly important set of tools and eyes, right? And hands to have to help you navigate the different terrains of institutionality and power. And that in doing that, it can save some of the labours of having to carry the experiences of some of these non-recognitions or dispossessions or violations or being seen as monstrous, right? And problematic or dangerous or whatever it is, from them just dropping onto your own shoulders. So they become like bulto, no, they become like a heavy thing that you're carrying and dragging along, and we're dragging it along and it's never been ours to carry, right? And we're dragging this shit along and it's making us exhausted and tired. And what it's also doing is becomes a block on that full feeling of the communal sorrow and grief that means we're not, because if you imagine we're walking on this line, right? The line is the frontier. It's not of life, it's of anti-life in some ways. So what does it mean to be actually able to walk that, to dance that frontier, right? Irreverently, with joy and together, to understand what's happening to us and to understand where there's spaces for doing different kinds of political manoeuvres, right? Yeah, with the right capacity, but then also to be able to draw back. We sometimes think that retreat is failure, but retreat can actually be something completely different outside of a logic of war, right? It's neither failure around the war or it's victory. It's actually we're doing something else. So when we can read collectively and do that labours, we can retreat to the spaces and do the work to drop into a grief and sorrow in a different way, where it doesn't become we're carrying more bultos, right? We're tensed and carrying on our shoulders and our thighs and unwell, right? But that we can actually transmute that into voice and vision and flow and ease. So I think there's a thing about reading the territories, which is really important together. And this thing of not leaving anyone behind is also absolutely mega, because all our lives count. So with Annette as well, where so many of our lives don't count they haven't historically, right? But they don't count and we're not countable. So what does it mean to go, we're not countable, but we're going to do other criterion and value because we're going to value each other together, right, in our spaces. But we know we have to take the time to do the labours together so we can have that time and space.
So, oh, wow. Okay. That's brilliant. I really, really, really like this idea of learning to read the territory. I think whatever context it is, right? I have a love-hate relationship with Hannah Arendt because I think some of her insights are just magnificent. Others are frighteningly racist. But the brilliance is so brilliant that I'm like, I'm just gonna have to wade through the racist. What are you gonna do? But one of the things about her work that I really like is this kind of constant focus on the political. In a sense, the idea that everything, everything, all institutions, there's a politics at work, it's all political. The navigation of a PhD candidature, the setup of an academic discipline, people I don't do politics. I'm like, you're lying. That's a political stance, right? There's no outside of politics, right? There's no outside of political. And for me, how I reinterpret, how to read the territory is about almost like a political phenomenology, our orientation, our kind of embodied relation to the world and to others, being attuned to the politics of that, right? And again, bear with me, bit of a tangent, but bear with me. I think it'll come together. My very first ever philosophy academic journal article was, the labor of parenting my child was so great. I stuck him in an institution and I went to get a public health job because that was easier. Joke, but not joke. So I worked in public health for a while and co-authored stuff in public health. And then I got a philosophy journal article. I was very, very excited. At the end of that journal article, the stance I basically claim for myself, I basically say that the stance I'm going to adopt is one of poetry and laughter. Kind of poetry, a kind of calculated indecipherability, and laughter and irreverence. And that's how I'm going to try and make my way through a philosophy institution in Australia that's very, very kind of monocultural in a lot of ways, right? Poetry and laughter. I find I spend a lot of time grappling with the poetry side of things. And the poetry side of things is kind of where the sorrow is accented. Mm-hmm. I find more and more and more I'm wanting to sit with and dwell with the laughter, the kind of cultivations of joy and irreverence, right? Deliberately, having fun with it. And I think it's possible, and I think there are irreverent ways to be in institutions that aren't necessarily oppositional, right? But aren't also bought in. I grew up in Zimbabwe, and for a lot of my childhood, I was a teenager when, apartheid formally came to an end. And I remember from South Africa, you'd always hear Pik Botha, the South African apartheid regime, their security apparatus was fixated with the subversive. They were terrified about the subversive who's going to kind of undermine the system. And I think there is a way of, again, laughter, irreverence, right? Those of us who are invested in more just institutions, more just societies. My current kind of bet is that there's something in laughter, there's something in irreverence that's subversive, but also that allows us to cultivate ways of being with each other that sustain us in whatever kind of institutional arrangements we find ourselves.
Okay.
Yeah.
Being sustained.
Yeah.
Not being absorbed.
Yeah.
There's a certain requirement of disinvestment, I think. Anyway, that's a whole.
Yeah. But also recognition. But also I wonder, the carrying our dead is important. The being being attuned to that's important.
But we think that carrying is a weight, right? So you think carrying, you think weight, but actually, when Karen's here, or when I invoke the ancestors, when it is done not because one is still being made to carry that which is not ours, because they're the markings of violations, right, or oppressions or non-recognitions, not on our own terms, but when it is done because we've done the work of dwelling and collectively healing to, start to begin to cultivate those relationships and those sovereignties otherwise. It's not a way. They hold us up. It's different. It shifts to being holding us up. They hold me here. And I'm not even talking about just an institutionality. It's a holding otherwise, and it's a guidance otherwise, actually. So there's a shifting from the relationship with the ghosts and the ancestors and the spirits who accompany us through time.
Is there laughter with the ghosts?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I think so. Potentially.
Yeah.
if one can create the space to breathe, to be able to continue laughter, right, and the joy, I think so. I don't necessarily think that they come into these spaces. They do come into these spaces, but they're also kind of, they do their own right capacity too, you know, and are not seen. Yeah. But I mean, I'm very interested in the also beyond, right? I don't know where we are with time. I'm very interested in the modes. We're good, right?
Yeah.
In the modes in which we also cultivate that other being, knowing that other doing in the world that is not constrained by being made to account or having to have forms of metrics that are recognizable, or, you know, kind of being forced into the contortions of splitting up this plurality and of spending a lot of time of reading the territory so we can survive and so we can continue to do what we need to do to support our kids or our families or whatever, and do the best that we can in the spaces that we find ourselves to do this work to dignity. But also then when we can breathe together and find the space and time otherwise, what that looks like what is involved in that, what are the kinds of practices or the lines or the thematics or the the invitations that involves for you, and I'm interested in that too.
That's, oh wow. Yeah. So you know, like that journal article, the title of the one of the poetry in the latter, the title of it is like inescapable colonialism. So it's like, you know, I wonder if, I wonder if at some level, like I'm always thinking like, so what do I actually think about this? And I'm, you know, I don't know that I think it's possible, as the way the world is currently configured, to get past. I don't know that there's an outside of that disciplinarity, those strictures that need to constantly reach the territory. I don't know that I ever feel at ease, if that makes sense. No, maybe that's not true. There's one context in which I do. There's a kind of chosen intellectual family, right? Intellectual community. And it's not ever present, and we're not all in the same geographical space. But yeah, I think what sustains me, what allows for kind of pockets of air, these spaces where we can just kind of breathe and exhale and not perform and not be hyper kind of aware. And just be at ease is the community that we cultivate. And but I've also learned that like it doesn't just appear, it doesn't just emerge, right? Like it takes work you invest in community. You have to, it's built, it's sustained, it's, you know, like Helen O in her book, Habits of Racism, she's got this, which is an incredible book. She explains how the stance that we held is actively held, whether that stance is a harmful or regressive one, or it's like an emancipatory or a liberatory one. We come to hold a particular kind of stance, and it's an act of holding. And I think you pour into, and you do this, right? You do this incredibly well. Like I've seen and I've benefited from you doing this. Like you spend yourself on behalf, or you contribute to sustaining spaces. You invite certain people into those spaces. And sometimes they collapse, sometimes because people, right? I'm one of those people who prefers the idea of humanity than actual human beings. Human beings are just a lot. People are hard. And so sometimes it goes pear-shaped, and it's not always lovely. But too much info. I only have one tattoo, and it's of a whale, and it's a kind of a constant reminder. How whales come up and they come for air. I feel like it's, especially as an academic, like there's this temptation to grit your teeth, hold your breath, and just kind of go until you collapse, right? And this reminder to come up for air, and the places for me, which are places of coming up for air, are places of those enlivening communities. But there's a cost to building and sustaining those enlivening communities. It sounds like a really long-winded answer.
No, because I like to sit in the mangroves. The mangroves, I talk about this a lot on teaching. I've written about the manglares, mangroves over in Awabakal. We were over in them for a little bit, like last Sunday before last. And, the mangroves sit for me as something Mestiza, as something really plural, as a horizon that is prefigurative and emergent right now. And here and ancient and new, And in those mangroves, in the time of invasion, the mangroves were seen as very dirty and disgusting and bestial. The mosquitoes and animals, things you didn't understand, swamp thing. So, of course, women and children and elders went and hid in there. Yeah?
Yeah.
But then they survived. Yeah? So the mangroves hold, they're smaller now, but they're regrown again. Actually, there's big bat colony and they're helping them regrow. And they hold that ancestral presence, right? They hold that survivance. But they also have this incredible ecology and ecology of intimacy. Leanne Simpson talks about this. I love this term, ecology of intimacy. Below the water. So they have this incredible capacity, the roots are coming up so that they're breathing. They have this capacity to exist within these meeting places of salt and fresh water. And the salt water, they can get the salt out so they get the oxygen. And then in the roots, they are sustaining all this wonderful life. Yeah. And so sometimes I go and sit there with the aunties and we listen. So we're trying to do like another cartography of the beings there. We're doing it as beings in Indigenous politics next to it's coming to that class. And we sit with to listen. So we're listening to the voices of ancestors and aunties and, elders and aunties and mob who have relation, right? So their voices, which we might recognise, or we might not. They're often elided as voices at all. So there's voices that are otherwise not recognised, right? But human voices. And then we're sitting with the non-human. So we're listening to the birds and we're listening to when the tide comes in and the walking of. There's a lot of mud crab. Mud crab is very important there. Mud crab is a bit like snake because mud crab, the female mud crabs are the bigger, and they lose their shell and they get another shell. So cycles, right? They get it. Things just have to end at a certain point, and that's all right. We keep going, right? We breathe together whatever was lost and continue to walk, right? And listen to their sounds. But then we also try to listen to the sounds of the ghosts and the ancestors, right? To make this polyphonic text of a cartography of the presence of survivance and sovereignties otherwise, of the city otherwise, of inhabiting the city with other relationalities of care and presence. And part of that is, learning to drop into the territories of the body, flesh territory, which are otherwise relegated to the monstrous and otherwise relegated to the irrational, otherwise relegated to that which needs to be mastered and tamed. And to drop into those territories of land, of Awabakal, of the mangroves, of the multiple beings and the ecology of intimacy, but to also see ourselves as part of that ecology of intimacy, and that our cuerpo, territorios, our body, flesh, also have these knowledges and wisdoms, new, ancient, becoming, and also have these kind of stories to tell that otherwise are silenced by the modern colonial renditions of reason, right, and knowing subjectivity, of philosophy, of political theory, of political making, of governance, of et cetera, and that, part of that is coming into relationship and embrace with parts of ourselves that are otherwise exiled and made monstrous, make in relation to other subjects in the plural sense who are otherwise rendered as voiceless, right? And sit and translate across multiple languages and create new languages. And I think that is those elements are another kind of reading of the territory. So there's a reading of the territory, the big T, and the institutionality and institutions and the cellar state of things, right? And unsettling that and navigating and surviving and doing what we can in those territories to cultivate spaces and relationships otherwise. And then there's like the reading of the territory, which is a writing in the sense of an R-I-T-I-N-G, something really, well, this is sacred too, right? But a sacred re-encounter and remembering of the knowledges of territories, territory of land, country, territory of our own territories in relation. And that we inevitably, as part of that, we learn other languages, and we it's not, the sorrow again. I don't use sorrow came up, and sorrow is right. I mean, joy as well, but sorrow and joy are related. But the sorrow becomes, I guess, a friend, right, in relation to, and a complex plural friend in relation. But that, we can't do that work here. But there's places, and we learn where you can do that work. There's places where we can do that work. So we can't do that here. We can do stuff to be tender. We can do stuff to be playful and irrelevant and poetic and poeticize a space that otherwise is rendered anaesthetized, right? But we can also then do in other spaces and places that kind of other relationship, and then perhaps then to not be knocked out by the sorrow and the anti-ethics. It's not about disassociating as much as about reconnecting and rebridging, and those kinds of translations feel important to me. I had another poem. Can I read another poem?
Sure.
You've made me remember liminal subjects, right? So it made me think of translation, and what do we do? So I was she's an activist scholar called Alyssa, who she couldn't get international funding here because she didn't meet the categories, because she published for movements and communities, right? And she was in Germany. So she found out a way to go into an institute in Germany with a woman who was doing social movements, and then I could do externals. As part of that, she could come over here for 6 weeks, and we did this thing called Rebellious Bodies in what you call it? Anyway, it's another community centre. We did that. And so part of our thing, she's coming from autonomous movements, and I'm obviously coming from a lot of the decolonial feminists, right? And hers is a very European underside, and mine's a kind of southern exteriority, right? A bit complex. And so we were like, how are we translating together? Like, how do we make sense of each other's plurality, right, and singularity, but also create the possibilities to come together in something that is common, right? And so I wrote this poem about it. It's called "And It's at the Back." So the last chapter is sonnets. Sonnets to all these different subjects, right? Antifa, Black Bloc, and autonomous affinities. And we sat by the sea, and I wrote it after she left, after we sat by the sea. I sit by the sea as a line of flight in the wind, blowing beneath and beyond the mythologies that seek to keep us apart. I remember when you told me what it felt like to be made hypervisible by the intrusive violent lights of the riot squad, invading the collectively held squat, kicking the families and their children, ripping up love letters and scraps of paper with handcrafted intricate counter maps, hauling you out to be photographed and punched, thrown out like rubbish from the civilized city. I remember us talking about the uses of invisibility, the desire not to be seen and verified by power, the wounding of interventions of non-being that could be the seeds of a formation of a language in common, which didn't seek to make us the same, and through which we might come to share the different places of our beginnings, the different roots of our becoming, and the shared desire to be liberated and free. I invite embrace of a daring and shared possibility, that the place from which I speak, impure, feminized, racialized non-being, might connect to your rejection of the being of alienation and rebellion into spaces of affinity and autonomy. I embrace the daring possibility of our co-creation of unimaginable tongues of the political, desires that cannot be contained by the categories we both refuse, we both seek to expose, escape, for their violence on our skins, in our heart, psyche, cities and land. How we might learn to disrupt the codes of our containment. How our joy might explode into multiple colours and delirious, joyous acts of disalienation and as healing. What might emerge when we put into dialogue direct action bunny, they have this big direct action bunny they were doing on the borders, right? And with ancestral kangaroo mama. What sparkling magic might be enabled by connection between dumpster god and Shakti erotic goddess? What sharing, co-learning, unlearning, and co-creating otherwise might cascade like waterfalls when autonomy, anarchy, queering, decoloniality, and Black feminisms learn to embrace? I have faith and hold space for our multiple spiraling becomings, visioning together, loving together, rising together.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
Hear it otherwise, right?
Oh, okay. Time has gone. I'm going to misbehave. Can I ask you one more question before we open up to the floor?
Go for it.
Okay. So, and this is I think this is an area of disagreement because, like, it's all been like lovely and cordial. So now we can have a food fight. Give the people what they want. No, I'm joking. So I hear you and I think, yes, there are ghosts and they're the ancestors.
Mm.
But then I keep thinking about coming into a discipline and an institution and not being surprised, not being perturbed by kind of absences and thinking, it's all good, like I'll do the thing. And not seeking out the kind of ghosts and ancestors in those academic institutions. And also sometimes, like when you come into a place, you might see folks who seem like they may be a little bit defeated or really tired, or kind of pushed to the margins in some ways.
Mm.
And like, the thing is, if you're kind of like all like geared up and ready to go and enthusiastic and powered up and have dreams and goals and ambitions, there's something abject about those folks, right? Those folks are, the exhausted, the disregarded are like the browning banana. You're like, I don't know that I want that. I kind of want this vibrancy, fresh, alive stuff because I want to be vibrant, fresh, and alive. I guess I'm just wondering, I am completely with the building outside, but institutions are such remarkably powerful things. And I'm wondering what happens if we think about what it means to build within. And part of building within means tending to and carrying the ghosts and the ancestors in the, in the institution, particularly the weary, the tired, the broken inside the institution, right? And you said the thing about we don't leave anybody behind. Maybe I'm just a bad person, but there is a temptation and a tendency towards, if anybody seems a little bit broken, being like, contagion, I want to keep my distance from them, right? As opposed to kind of embrace how do we build with, how do we help recoup and resuscitate. And lastly, like I'm wary of words like solidarity because they sound too good and come out too easily, right? And the work of them, and again, people, like the work and the difficulty of them is too often elided. But like in a non-celebratory, non-cheap, non-easy way, like what is both honoring the kind of both ghosts and ancestors, solidarity with the marginalized and the struggling, and how much space, how much possibility does that allow for a kind of building within the institution and potentially a subversion of the institution towards more just ends?
I mean, we kind of do it all the time, right? Look, we are the institution, but we are not just the institution. We're not just contained by the institution. So I think you've got to remember that. The capital relation form make up the institution. We actually are the bloody institution and nothing else. But I think, talking about bananas. So there was an exhibition, right? So one of the students did an exhibition and they had a banana, right? And the banana was supposed to be free. It was had a meaning. And the banana was wrapped up, right? Because of, I don't know, health and safety saying it. So the banana was liberated in the exhibition and was free. And the banana, and so the point is we didn't mind that the banana was living. We didn't mind that the banana was going brown. And it was like, we actually thought about putting bananas all over the place, right? So it's like, for me, that brokenness, a brokenness or I don't know, bloody mouldy or something, or we're going brown. We are brown, but we're going brown, is a privileged site. It's not something behind. Like the plurality that you asked me about in the beginning is also cracked as fuck. Like I have, the whip and the slash of the violence is crisscrosses my line and me, right? So for me, it's a site of privilege actually, and the subjects are subjects or non-subjects who are falling behind or out of time or can't keep up or are unruly or are seen as deviant are often the very subjects who have the epistemic privilege of reading the complexities of how power works, but also how you survive power and also how you might disrupt to create the possibilities for other modes of education as life and critical pedagogy and research as commoning and research as this plurality. So there's a constant plurality. So the plurality doesn't go of being in but not the, in that sense, as well as this outside. And in fact, it's the opposite. I would say that a lot of energy and time goes into the institutional space in order to create the reading the territory and the possibility for these kinds of work and praxis. And sometimes that then undercuts the capacity to do the time and space of sitting in the mangroves or doing those cartographies, because some of that work is also dependent on, recognitions of and financing and stuff like that because of precarity. So I don't think they work in contradiction. I do think there's a tension sometimes in terms of time and space and energy. But I wouldn't, I think those subjects who are often seen as, the failing are the ones really. That's it,
That's amazing. So, I mean, we had said we might get people to take some time, but I think it's 25 to 12, so we've only got about 25 minutes left. 25 to 1, sorry.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, so I'm thinking maybe we should open up for questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. So,
There you go. Okay. If I've got any questions or comments or reflections on the spirit there in the Zoom world, or to share anything, to share a poem as well if you want.
Any questions online, Josh? No?
I'm asking them.
Okay.
None so far.
Okay, well, on the end of this one, I'll ask you a question. Okay, so make the point, Brian, that institutions are powerful things.
Yeah.
I fear there's a little bit, and I'll be provocative because that's we're in an institution, we're in a university. There seems that we're very comfortable with the pluralities that exist in our identities, and we have to embrace them and I would suggest we've even been talking about dragging them with us into institutions, right? It's the ultimate liberation not to be able to say, I am plural identities, but in this space, I can act in a way that's consistent with this identity without being burdened by the other one.
Ooh.
I would suggest people are going to be much more successful in life if you can wear those different hats, because when you drag, and I think it's, and forgive me if I'm wrong here, but there's a lot of acknowledgement of the biases of institutions, but not as much acknowledgement of the biases of our identities, right? So our non-conforming identities we have commonalities with the other people who are damaged, but we don't see the bias in that at all. And then we see the bias completely in the institution that we feel alien to. But I would suggest to you and people in their lives and people in work and with family, if you can wear different hats, you can say, in this institution, this job, I can be a particular person, I can be successful without being burdened by any of the other identities I'm not willing to sell out on, but they're not going to allow me to flourish in this environment. Then I just go sit in the mangroves or play music or be some other identity where I'm not at all burdened by the identity that I have here. I don't think the modern world allows us to do that because we all get dragged into multiple roles and you're identified as this person, therefore you should be acting like this in a different environment. But I'm going to ask you, is the ultimate liberation and to find peace in these different places, being able to say, here are my multiple identities, I'm able to cut that off and bring none of the pain or the identity that doesn't fit in this new environment with me and therefore flourish in this space? Or do you have to be all the things all of the time?
Oh, that's a great question. It's a great question. So I'm going to betray us both a little bit and invoke Scott, but that's okay. Rather than an Irish person. There's this guy, Alistair McIntyre, right? He's a Scottish philosopher. And he's complicated, but he does this really interesting work on kind of rival moral traditions. And there's a question, I think like the question that he'd ask is this idea of flourishing. When we ask the question about flourishing, we're asking it from within a particular kind of moral tradition, right? And it's like, where are we sitting? Which tradition are we asking the question from? And where we're sitting will determine the kinds of answer that we might give towards flourishing, right? So, and it's got this beautiful book, After Virtue, where he's like, the trouble with a contemporary neoliberal context is we reduce the person into an individual and we ask about the maximization of various preferences, as opposed to thinking about what constitutes good or justice in a holistic kind of sense, holistic for the individual, but also the individual understood as a unit of a community, right? And so for me, the question is, what kind of manner of being at work makes for, allows for flourishing understood as not just the maximization of my individual preferences, but a more just society and a healthier state of being for me as a member of a community and the community as a whole. And if that's the frame, then, there still isn't an easy answer, but I think if we woke up in the morning on if when we got up on a Monday morning, the question was, what manner of being makes for a healthier me, a healthier us, and a healthier society? What do I bring into work to contribute to cultivating that? There's going to be a different answer to how do I achieve success? And I think that's what we need to grapple with. I know there isn't, an answer, more like an invitation to a reframing. But what do you think?
Nice. Yeah. Well, the mangroves are part of running the city otherwise, and care for country and decolonizing the city. So it's not separate. So it's not leisure, if you see what I mean, or it's not therapeutic healing. It's actually that these relationships with community and these understandings of well-being and sustainability and who and for the city should be and what should be the relationship with the uni to the city, and is part of that. So it kind of maybe hints a bit to the plural subject, because that's what you're talking about, that there is a plural sense in which we are subjects. When we can hold space for that, we can hold space for the invitation to dialogue in the institutional space about that. Yeah. When often there isn't space, right? But these kinds of spaces allow us to at least touch on this and to begin to speak stuff like this. And then I think that what I was saying about brokenness or trauma or ways in which we are not the understanding of the dominant subject, not as damage, the reverse, that a system that makes those subjects damaged is the system that's damaged. Because actually those subjects who are other, which often are the majority actually, including our students, have these incredible knowledges with which to solve global issues that we're facing in very localized, specific ways. And in complex ways within an institutional confines, but not, in the last question that Bryan asked, it's not, I am in the institution and honour the ghosts of the institution all the time, and the ancestors and the steps of the lineages and people who've been here and are now no longer here in complex ways. So, but it's also about having and finding the space to talk about navigating together in the best ways possible, so that one is not exhausted and merely carrying the bulto, right? Carrying the ghost, right, in the way that you said. So I think the way that you came at that was really beautiful, because it asked a question back about who are the subjects, firstly. So how do we learn to translate across those different sense of who we are as beings, and listen to that plurality in that being in the world, particularly when there's very little space for us to do that. We don't have that, and so there is something special about being in a space like this right now with this diverse array of people, some of whom I talk to a lot, some of whom not at all, right, or very rarely. And what does it mean to hold space for each other?
Yes. At the university, I've been also a part of my research otherwise. How the university look into politics. Because most of the universities say political science, and then international relations, and then there is a politics of making something into something, like politics into management, politics into diplomacy. This type of dangerous tendencies of the universities. How do you look into politics?
That's an incredibly difficult question. That's brilliant. Do you know, when I say something strange, I think the problem might be the opposite, right? I think the problem is we're not as, I think the problem is we don't want to see the politics as much as we should, right? Like, so if you're starting places that it's all political, that whenever you have, if you've got two people in a room, the question of how they relate is a question of ethics. How do you behave with each other? If you've got three people in a room, beyond ethics, there's a question of politics, right? Because it's not just a question of a one-to-one relationship. It's a, what does justice among the three of us look like, right? And there's an implicit micropolitics at work everywhere. And I think some of the problems we have are because we're not explicit about that, right? If the next departmental meeting was understood as a political forum, as opposed to understood in, management is about efficiency, but also because it's an exercise of authority, it's also and because it's also about like organizing individuals to act in a certain way. Management is about politics as well, right? Management is inherently political. The difficulty is it's much more efficient to manage people where the politics is invisible, right? Can you imagine every time there was a decision about what we're going to do something, if we had to decide if we're going to have a referendum about it, if, like, you know, like we had to make sure everybody was politically informed, you know, like management by diktat is much more efficient than kind of management by consensus. The fact that efficiency is the overriding value is something that goes unquestioned, which shouldn't, but I guess what I'm saying is, in a convoluted way, everything's political. And I think we tend to think that if we try and evade politics, then things will be more pleasant and things will be smoother. And that might be true, but then they're also less just and less healthy. And so that's the trade-off, right? The trade-off is, the challenge is, can we bring to the fore the political dimensions of stuff without necessarily reducing everything into a fractious food fight in ways that kind of help ensure that decisions and actions that we're taking as caring as possible given the constraints that we're under.
If we don't mind interjection, I think that's absolutely brilliant. That is the reality. And the only thing I challenge you on is, you know, you say, well, if efficiency is the agenda, but maybe it shouldn't be. But that's assuming that you think it shouldn't be, right? So other people might say that's what it should be, because the other point you make is also totally valid. That if you try to get a more just, equitable outcome, and you have consensus, you're assuming that everybody who's got a voice in that has that same outcome in mind as well, so that they see that. And you go back to your three people, and they start playing politics. So again, it's the same problem, humans, right? So humanity is a lovely idea, but when the humans start behaving, then it starts to break down. And I'm not suggesting that, you know, one versus the other. Would be ideal to have a consensus-based model that leads to not just potentially even a more efficient outcome. So German industrial relations, Josh would argue that the collective actually leads to a more efficient approach to things because everyone gets a voice and you avoid the problems that are going to hit you later on, right? So the system is set up saying that consensual based industrial relations at a macro level is actually more efficient, right? But you need everybody to act in that good faith then, right? And then if you go down to a department or down to three people, then you start playing the politics. And I also really appreciate your comments about the fact that the politics are there whether or not we make them explicit or not. And I think there's an awful lot of that in the world where we don't want to talk about I often use that phrase, the elephant in the room. It doesn't remove the elephant. We just decided we're not talking about it. So I'm conscious that this is recorded, so I won't say too much about it. That's a business school, but I'm with you.
If I may, I'll just share with you a couple of the comments online. So a few people had to leave a little bit early, so they've thanked you for your contributions. And Wolf commented to say, it's funny, I seem to come back to the subversive and humour as a queer person, techniques that assist us to live in institutions to some degree. It's always been my preferred method of change and communication.
It's nice.
I have a question. Bridging off of what you talked about last, considering everything is political and what science actually represents, do you find the discipline that you work or lecture under is limiting to your work or what you're working towards? And if so, how? Like the division of disciplines, if you know what I mean. That fracturing of
It's a lovely question. You know, I'm strange in the sense that like I have like an ongoing fight with the philosophy establishment in Australia, and I've had one for a long time because I'm like, we're not always what it says on the tin, and again, if you look at our composition, there's clearly a problem. So what are we doing about it, right? The reason I stay though is, at least in its an ideal form, at its best, the thing with philosophy that I like is its freedom. My favorite definition of what philosophy is basically there's two. One says that it's a community of the question about the possibility of the question. I don't yet know what that means, but I love the fact that the questions are the heart of it, right? And that says to me like opening. And there's another definition that says philosophy is the co-creation of desire. And again, I don't know what that means particularly, but there's something really kind of appealing and intriguing to me about that. So there's the discipline and its academic institutionalization. You know, I find like I'm always fighting with my colleagues, with my workplace, with broader society association, because I don't think we often do a good job of living up to the ideals of the discipline by virtue of just the kind of one constraints that exist, but also two, people's investments, right? And again, you're right, like, like part of politics is the neoliberal creed is the pursuit of self-interest ultimately works out to the greater good. You know, I don't buy that, but what it's done is it's legitimated the pursuit of singular self-interest as opposed to the pursuit of the common good, right? And sometimes I feel people's pursuit of self-interest, like, it just harms, it distorts and it harms like a collective endeavor, like like philosophy. Having said that, much more than in other disciplines, I experience a bunch of freedom. So I don't have to do things the way this particular author did them because they've set up they've set up a whatchamacallit that everybody else follows, right? So there's a freedom to that I really appreciate. It feels like,
Disciplinary.
yeah, it feels like
I hold disciplinary. Like, so politics obviously is a colonial subject. It's a settler colonial subject. So it's not just a neoliberal subjectivity, right? It's premised in possessive individualism and governance, which takes certain institutions as a given, right? But I hold politics because there's this plural of the political. There's been traditions historically. Our ancestors are ghosts in the present, which understand questions of authority, of decision, of resources, of the good life, of how we do and take decisions, how we organise our cities, our spaces, our spatialities, our territories differently. And so I hold it with a small p in the plural. And then with others, cultivate communities of care within the institutional dynamics that push to decolonize, to feminize, to render from the exterior or the abject what might become visible with all the qualifiers about, we talk about what it means to become visible in disciplinary logics. And to do so through cultivating desire and joy, right? And life making where we can, and the breath to create spaces of teaching and learning, to create writings, to create research collectives, to create other forms of disciplinary in different spatial places that do that work and say, we weren't supposed to have survived and we are still here.
Yeah. I mean, there's sometimes people, out of understandable frustration, are like, yep, nope, I quit, I've had it with this discipline, I've had it with this thing. And I understand, I genuinely understand that impulse, and I'm sympathetic to it. But again, that kind of laughter, right? That's a version that there's something, and there's a deep romanticism in me. Like I've you know, it's taken me a long time to come to terms with it and accept it, and you know, like I'm slowly embracing it, right? But part of that tilting at windmills thing is there's something joyous, I think, about being like, so this is what this thing could be, right? Currently, this is what it's been made to be, but this is what this thing could be. And what it could be is something that's beautiful, is something that's emancipatory, is something that's good. And there's joy in pursuing that, especially if you can find like a band of merry folks who want to go on that quest with you, right?
I think there's also the genealogical. Perhaps you need to broaden the genealogical of the pedagogical and the educational, really, and the sites and spaces where that occurs, as well as with the capital U and the institution with the capital I. Because I do think that in this moment historically, we're at a point where the plural, also in terms of education for life, is being birthed, rebirthed again because of the certain asphyxiation. So I think there's the romanticism has edges.
Oh, absolutely.
You know,
absolutely.
I think it has a lot of edges, and where it can be brought back into a logic of salvaging.
Yeah.
And what that then does to the space and time to be able to drop into these other kind of pedagogical, epistemological relationships, you know, and I do think there is a tension there that maybe there's the frontier that cuts across the romanticizing to keep that as not a tragedy.
No, absolutely.
Not a tragedy,
absolutely.
but as actually a possibility, right? A generative possibility.
Yeah. But isn't that, I mean, like, absolutely. And I wonder if, I mean, the part of the carrying our dead, the staying with ghosts, right? Like, is that you have your particular ancestors, but those aren't the only ancestors that exist. And in some ways, I mean, like Western political thought, the biggest flaw, you know, the thing that hamstrings it the most is this narrowness of only honoring their particular ancestors, right? And not being able to see the beauty, the worth, the value, the magnificent intellect in other traditions. You know, and there is something, and again, you know, like this immense challenge of how do you engage with, how do you revel in, how do you commune with other traditions, you know, other lines of inquiry in ways that aren't expropriating, right? In ways that aren't like the worst of violent expropriative mining, you know, but in ways that are genuinely kind of like relational and just.
And I think to remember the ghost dance too, and the ancestors hold us.
Can I suggest that 1 o'clock, because this is the normal time we wrap this up. It's obviously been a very different format and refreshingly different. One of the things I noticed in this thread since we started the meeting was that I think it was summed up perfectly at the end there. There's a joy in the pursuit, right? I think that if we're looking for a way to end this conversation, there is no point, right? So the joy is in the pursuit and having these conversations. And this was like a very interesting forum for the management discipline to have. And I thank Sara and Bryan so much for being here and sharing your thoughts and perhaps provoking a few thoughts in our heads, ask questions and take joy in that pursuit. So thank you very much. So we'll kill the Zoom, but everybody else have a conversation if you want.
Bye.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming.